All right, well, so what? Let's go backwards in time, Darwin's 1850s or so, and let's go back 20 years or so before that to the Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard, in many ways, started psychology before we even had the word, because he argued that human beings are so smart that we literally come to realize that we exist. Like in psychological parlance today, we call that self-awareness or consciousness. And the point that Kierkegaard made was that only human beings are smart enough to render themselves an object of their own subjective inquiry. And I teach at a fancy private school, so I tell the students, go tell your mom and dad that, so when they get the $50,000 tuition bill, they'll realize that there's something potentially of value here. Right? It's a turgid phrase, right, to render yourself an object of your own subjective inquiry. But the point that Kierkegaard makes, I think, is of great importance, and that is that not only are you here, but you know that you're here. And at Skidmore, I'll say to the students, please raise your hand if you're aware of the fact that you're now here listening to me or pretending to do so. And I can often get 50, 60% of the students to do that. In most public venues, I could do much better than that. And of course, I'm being silly, but Kierkegaard's point is an important one. A rose bush is here, but doesn't know it. A fly is here, but doesn't know it. I'm not going to argue with you about whether your dog knows that it's here or not. All I need you to do is to acknowledge that you're here. And the point that Kierkegaard makes in a very tiny volume called Fear and Trembling is that once you're aware of your own existence, you necessarily experience two uniquely human emotions that he referred to as awe and dread, respectively. And I wish we had more time, but let's do 30 seconds of awe before things take a turn for the worse momentarily. It is awesome to be alive and to know it, and I do think it's tremendously important that we don't lose track of that fact. And I know that all of you, I hope, are aware of this, hopefully, on a routine basis. Who's ever gotten up one day and nothing in particular has happened? You didn't win a Nobel Prize, you didn't write a symphony, you didn't win the state lottery, you just woke up, maybe got a face full of fresh air, maybe saw it's raining and see some raindrops bouncing off a tree, and you just say to yourself, life is good, it is great to be alive. Head shakes if you've ever had those moments. I grew up in New Jersey. They were rare, but I think all of us, particularly when we are young, literally just wallow in the spontaneous exuberance of life itself. It is awesome to be alive and to know that we're here, right? But Kierkegaard turns right around and he says, but you know what? It's also dreadful, to borrow a phrase from William Faulkner, unless you are a child or an idiot, if you are alive, then you will also realize that, like every living thing, you will someday not be here. And I don't want to ruin your dinner, but I would just assert that this is true for all of us, that one of the unintended consequences of self-awareness, which is in turn a consequence of our vast intelligence, is that we are the only form of life that is aware from a rather early age that we will someday die. And I know some of you make lists. Who has lists? Pay the phone bill, take out the trash, walk the dog, die. All right, that's not anything that routinely appears on most of our to-do lists, and in fact, there's a good reason for that, and that is that I would argue that most of us would happily postpone that in perpetuity if we could do so in a relatively healthy body. So that's problem number one, according to Kierkegaard. He calls it the paradox of finitude in the context of infinitude. We have minds that are capable of transcending the boundaries of time and space, but as far as we know, those minds are ensconced in a corporal container, that being our body, that will someday wither and die. Not only that, but we are also smart enough to know that our death can occur at any time for reasons that we could never anticipate or control. So it'd be great, it'd be one thing if I knew I was going to live for 100 years and that I would expire very peacefully in my bed with my family around me, yoked arm in arm, chanting Kumbaya as they sent me into the beyond. But I know that that's not true. I know that I could walk outside today and get hit by a meteor. I know that the white powder in the envelope that my students sent me could be anthrax. I know that that little pain in my stomach might be indigestion. Maybe it's a softball-sized malignant tumor, the harbinger of ill events to come. So we know we will someday die. We know that we could die at any time for reasons that we could never anticipate or control. And that's bad enough. That's Kierkegaard. But then Becker, just to give us a little metaphorical knee in the groin, he says, you know, there's something else, and it's something that Freud always reminded us of, and that is that we don't like the fact that we're animals. Some of you here, because we're in a movie theater, who's seen the Elephant Man film? Have some of you seen that movie? It's a great movie. And do you remember when the Elephant Man says, I am not an animal? It's one of the great lines in the film. And you're sitting there and you're like, go, Mr. Pachyderm. I know, I love that. All right, but as much as we sympathize with the Elephant Man, we also know that that's not the case. Not only is he an animal, but so too are you. Bleeding, defecating, ejaculating, menstruating, vomiting, post-nasal dripping, exfoliating. Stop me or I'll keep going. A piece of biological protoplasm that is from a purely natural point of view, no more significant or enduring than a lizard or a potato. And the point that Becker makes is that human beings would literally be paralyzed with abject terror if that's the only thing that we thought about. I am going to die someday. I could die at any time. I'm a cold cut with an attitude. I'm a pate with panache. I'm spam with a plan, but I have no can. And all of those realizations add up, according to Becker, to literally just debilitating us with paralyzing terror. And yet, to be silly for a moment, not only do you not appear to be overly apprehensive, but most of you seem downright amused, and that makes no sense. You should be just a quivering pile of biological protoplasm cowering under your chair, groping for a sedative as large as a basketball. Right? But you're not, and that raises the question of why not? And what Becker hypothesizes is that our ancestors rather ingeniously but quite unconsciously solved the problem of the massive anxiety engendered by the uniquely human awareness of death through the construction and maintenance of what anthropologists today call culture, which he defined as humanly created beliefs about the nature of reality that we share with other people in our group, the primary, although clearly not the sole function of which is to reduce the anxiety that's engendered by the uniquely human awareness of death. And what Becker does is he goes on and he says, okay, let's figure out how culture does that. And he introduces two terms that I think are rather straightforward, and they are meaning and value. He just says, well, look, when we look from an anthropological point of view about what culture does for us, one thing is very clear, and that is that it gives us on a good day a sense that we live in a world that has meaning. And in support of that claim, what he notes is that all cultures have an account of the origin of the universe. All cultures have a blueprint of appropriate conduct, the satisfaction of which renders us eligible for immortality. All cultures, as far as we know, have provisions either for literal immortality, the afterlives, the heavens, and the reincarnations that are given to us by the world's great religions, or if not that, or in addition to that, all cultures provide some opportunities for what Robert J. Lifton called symbolic immortality. We know that we may not be here forever, but we're also comforted by the fact that through having children, through acquiring great fortunes, through great achievements in science and art, that some physical vestige of our existence will persist nonetheless. What Becker insists is that the perception that we live in a meaningful universe is absolutely essential for psychological equanimity. And what he points out is that when we lose that sense, who's ever had a vague sense that life isn't all that meaningful? You ever have a bad day when you're like, I'm not quite sure? Well, in Becker's language, he says, well, you know, when we think that when we lose a sense that life has meaning, and I love these terms, he says, we become disillusioned. And when we become disillusioned, that renders us demoralized. We no longer have a confident basis for action. And that's why the depressed people can't get out of bed in the morning. So the sense that life has meaning is absolutely necessary, but not sufficient, because Becker then turns around and he says, well, you know, not only do we need to believe that we live in a meaningful world, we also need to believe that we as individuals are significant or valuable contributors to that world. Who remembers being a kid? That's a rhetorical question, but feel free to be honest. Did anybody ever dream about doing something great? You ever sit on a rock in the playground and say, I'm going to be a professional athlete and win the Super Bowl? Or I'm going to win a Nobel Prize when I cure cancer? Or I'm going to be like Mother Teresa and just help people out? Rhetorical question. Anybody ever have those thoughts? And Becker makes an important point, and that is that that's not pathological narcissism. That is the normal yearning of the human animal to do something valuable and significant. And what he argues, following the sociologists, particularly the symbolic interactionists, is that the way culture gives us opportunities to feel valuable is through the provision of social roles. And the different social roles have associated standards, and when we satisfy those standards, we can perceive ourselves as people of value in a world of meaning. And then he just puts all these ideas together. He says, if you are lucky enough or diligent enough to perceive yourself as a person of value in a world of meaning, you have self-esteem. And I know you've heard that term before. Who's heard the term self-esteem before? It's the most common term in the psychological lexicon. But what I like about Becker is he actually defines the term. William James told us that self-esteem is the most important human attribute, but he never got too far in terms of helping us understand why. What Becker did, and I think it's a considerable achievement, is to not only define self-esteem as the belief that you're a person of value in a world of meaning, but to also help us understand two things. One is that the need for self-esteem is universal. People in all times and places need to believe that they are valuable members of a meaningful universe. On the other hand, we can't get self-esteem directly for ourselves, by ourselves, because the way that we obtain self-esteem is by adhering to the standards of value associated with the social roles in the context of the culture to which we belong. And although we're not going to have time to explore that notion in great detail tonight, I think it's profoundly important, because what it suggests is that on the one hand we need self-esteem, but because we don't get it for ourselves, by ourselves, what might get you tremendous self-regard in one time and place might get you ostracized or killed in another. So just an obvious example, and a controversial one, but therefore more interesting. Let's just think about homosexuality. Who's aware of the fact that in certain communities today it's frowned on somewhat? Right? And who's also aware that in different times and places, the ancient Greeks didn't frown on it so much, and there are cultures where it is not only tolerated but considered to be an acceptable form of human conduct. And it's the point of this is not to worry about who's right or wrong so much as just to note that the same affectation that's highly valued in one time and place might not be in another. All right, well, those are Becker's ideas in a nutshell, and so now let's just consider how those ideas help us address the three problems that we identified at the outset that puts human beings at the proverbial crossroads. All right, let's talk about man's inhumanity to man. Why is it that human beings have such a difficult time getting along with other folks who don't share their beliefs? And here Becker has two ideas, and both of them I find to be very provocative. Idea number one is as follows. He says, okay, let's say that he's right, that your beliefs about reality serve a death-denying function. If that's the case, he proposes, then the mere existence of people with radically different beliefs poses a challenge, because if you accept the validity of an alternative conception of reality, you necessarily undermine the confidence with which you subscribe to your own beliefs, and in so doing expose yourself to the very anxiety that those beliefs were erected to reduce in the first place.